Dorothy Henderson's coffee cup slipped from her arthritic fingers, ceramic shattering against the kitchen floor as she watched the German Shepherd drop half his breakfast into storm drain 47 for the seventh consecutive morning. It wasn't random begging. It was deliberate, ritualistic feeding of something hidden below. The elderly neighbors gathered at their windows, Mrs. Patterson clutching her chest, Eleanor Kaufman's hand flying to her mouth as an unmistakable sound drifted up from the underground darkness, the desperate mewling of trapped kittens, punctuated by something else, a hollow scratching that made Dorothy's nurse-trained instincts scream danger. The loyal dog had been standing guard over Maple Street's storm drain since Harold's funeral 3 years ago, and Dorothy had dismissed it as grief-addled wandering. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, her wedding ring catching morning light as she reached for the phone. What was Sargent protecting down there, and why had he chosen her, a broken-hearted widow, to finally witness his secret? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dorothy Henderson had lived 72 years in Millbrook Falls, West Virginia, and she'd learned to read trouble like a medical chart. The German Shepherd, sitting vigil by storm drain 47, was trouble wrapped in matted fur and military precision, the kind that made her retired ICU nurse instincts prickle with unease. Her modest 1956 mining cottage creaked in the October wind, a reminder that Harold's pension had died with him 3 years ago. The property tax notice on her kitchen table demanded $2,847 by month's end, or the county would take the only home she'd ever known. Social Security stretched thin at $1,200 monthly, especially when arthritis medication cost more than groceries. "Morning, Harold," she whispered to the framed photo beside her coffee maker, a ritual that kept loneliness at bay. Officer Harold Henderson stared back in his dress blues, his K-9 partner, a different German Shepherd, sitting proudly beside him. 37 years on the force, and you never brought your work problems home, unlike some dogs I could mention. Through her lace curtains, Dot studied the mysterious animal. Sargent, as she'd begun calling him, maintained perfect posture despite the pronounced limp in his right hind leg. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle and chest, not from fights but from something more deliberate. His behavior patterns were too precise for a stray. Arriving at exactly 6:45 a.m. and 5:30 p.m., scanning the street with professional alertness before performing his strange feeding ritual. Millbrook Falls had withered since the mines closed. Population dropped from 3,200 to barely 847 souls, clinging to Appalachian pride and government assistance. 40% of houses stood condemned, their windows boarded like closed eyes. The town's storm drain system, built during the coal boom of 1962, connected to abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the mountain like infected veins. Mayor Clayton Murphy had implemented aggressive urban renewal policies since taking office 2 years ago. His latest crusade targeted public health hazards, a category that apparently included stray animals. Murphy had transformed from the grieving widower who'd buried his wife Ellen and daughter Sarah after the 2020 mine disaster into something harder, more obsessed with control. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, 85 and sharp as her tongue, had warned everyone about that dangerous dog. But Dot recognized something Patterson missed. Sargent's protective stance wasn't aggression. It was duty. The scratching sounds from below the drain haunted Dot's dreams. Kittens, certainly, but something else moved down there in the darkness. Something that made Sargent's ears flatten against his skull and his scarred lip curl in silent warning. "Harold always said, trust your gut," Dot murmured, pulling on her threadbare cardigan. "Mine's telling me that dog's not guarding against something getting out. He's protecting something from getting in." The morning light caught Sargent's amber eyes as he glanced toward her window. For one electric moment, recognition flickered between them, two old soldiers acknowledging shared duty. Something was terribly wrong in Millbrook Falls, and Dorothy Henderson suspected she was the only one left who cared enough to find out what. The leftover meatloaf had been Harold's favorite: beef, pork, and her secret ingredient of Worcestershire sauce that made him kiss her cheek every Sunday dinner. Now it sat cooling on Dot's counter, enough for two people who'd become just one. She wrapped half in wax paper, grabbed her late husband's police-issue flashlight, and stepped into the crisp October morning. Sargent's ears pricked forward as she approached, his amber eyes tracking her movement with the intensity of a trained officer. Up close, his scars told stories: a jagged line across his left shoulder, puncture marks on his chest that looked suspiciously like bullet fragments. This wasn't some backyard brawler. This was a dog who'd seen war. "Easy, boy," Dot murmured, extending the meatloaf. "I know you're hungry." Sargent's nostrils flared, testing her scent. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because his tail gave a tentative wag. He accepted the food with gentle teeth, but instead of eating, he carried it to the storm drain's rusted grate. With deliberate precision, he tore the portion in half, dropped one piece through the metal bars, then settled down to eat his share. From below came an immediate response, desperate mewing that made Dot's heart clench. Not one kitten, but several, their cries echoing through the underground labyrinth like lost souls. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she breathed, kneeling beside the drain despite her arthritic knees. The flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet before darkness swallowed it whole, but in that brief illumination, she caught a glimpse of movement, small forms scrambling toward the fallen food, and something else that made her breath catch, a flash of pink fabric, child-sized. Sargent whined softly, pressing his scarred muzzle against the grate. The sound he made wasn't quite grief, wasn't quite hope. It was the sound of someone keeping vigil over the dead. The next morning, Dot positioned herself at her kitchen window with Harold's old binoculars. Sargent arrived at exactly 6:45 a.m., his internal clock more reliable than the town's broken church bells. She watched him perform his ritual, drop the food, eat his portion, then settle into what she now recognized as a military guard position. At 7:15, Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house across the street, her silver hair pinned in the same victory rolls she'd worn since 1952. She marched toward Sargent with the determination of a woman who'd buried 3 husbands and outlived 2 wars. "Shoo! Get away from there, you mangy thing!" Patterson waved her walking stick. "That drain's been nothing but trouble since they put it in. Floods every spring, stinks every summer." Sargent didn't budge. His hackles rose slightly, a low rumble building in his chest, not aggressive but warning. Patterson stopped mid-stride, suddenly aware she was facing 90 pounds of scarred muscle and unwavering purpose. "Dangerous," she muttered, retreating to her porch. "Mark my words, Dorothy Henderson. That animal's going to hurt someone." But Dot had worked 37 years in trauma units. She knew the difference between a predator and a protector. Sargent wasn't guarding territory. He was standing post over something precious. On the 3rd day, Dot brought binoculars and patience. She watched Sargent's routine expand beyond simple feeding. Every 15 minutes, he'd circle the drain, nose to the ground, checking for threats. When leaves blocked the grate, he'd clear them with careful pause. When a delivery truck rumbled too close, he'd position himself between the drain and potential danger. This wasn't random behavior. This was a mission. At 10 a.m., Mayor Murphy's black Suburban pulled up to the curb. Clayton Murphy stepped out, 58 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than Dot's monthly budget. He'd been handsome once, before grief carved lines around his eyes and hardened his jaw into permanent disapproval. "Mrs. Henderson," his voice carried the authority of old money and newer tragedy. "We need to discuss this situation." Dot met him on her front porch. Harold's coffee mug still warm in her hands. "What situation would that be, Mayor?" "That animal." Murphy nodded toward Sargent, who'd risen to his feet, every muscle tense. "Multiple complaints about aggressive behavior, public health concerns. The health department's received reports of possible rabies exposure." "From who?" Dot's nurse training kicked in. "I haven't seen any aggressive behavior. That dog's been nothing but gentle. Mrs. Patterson filed an official complaint yesterday. Says the animal threatened her with unprovoked aggression." Murphy's pale eyes were cold as January creek water. "I'm authorized to have animal control remove it today." "Over my dead body." The words came out sharper than Dot intended, carrying 37 years of standing up to doctors, administrators, and anyone who threatened her patients. "That dog's protecting something down there. Something that needs protecting." Murphy's expression flickered. Just for a moment, Dot caught something that looked like fear. "Mrs. Henderson, that drain connects to old mine shafts. Unstable ground, potential cave-ins, toxic gas accumulation. It's condemned property. Anything down there is beyond help." "Kittens aren't beyond help." Dot stood straighter, channeling every inch of her German-Irish stubbornness. "I hear them crying. That dog's been feeding them, keeping them alive." "Raccoons," Murphy said quickly. "Probably raccoons. They make similar sounds when disturbed." But Dot had heard the difference. She'd worked pediatric wards long enough to recognize the specific pitch of infant distress, whether human or feline. "Then let's find out. Call the fire department. Get someone down there with proper equipment." "Absolutely not." Murphy's voice carried finality. "I won't risk emergency responders for what's likely a rabid animal's nest. The drain will be sealed with concrete next week as part of our infrastructure improvement project." "Sealed?" Horror flooded through Dot. "If there are animals down there, then they'll be put out of their misery." Murphy turned toward his Suburban, then paused. "Mrs. Henderson, I noticed your property taxes are in arrears. The county would hate to see you lose this house over poor judgment regarding public safety." The threat hung in the autumn air like smoke from a distant fire. Dot watched Murphy drive away, her hands trembling with rage and fear. Beside the storm drain, Sargent had never moved, never taken his eyes off the mayor's retreating vehicle. "What did you see down there, boy?" she whispered. "What's got Clayton Murphy so scared he'd threaten an old woman?" That evening, Dot sat on her porch with Harold's case files, boxes she'd never had the heart to sort through. Somewhere in those yellowed reports and faded photographs might be answers. Harold had been investigating something before his heart attack took him. Something about the mines, about safety violations, about... Her breath caught. There, in a file marked Murphy Development 2020, was a photograph of Mayor Murphy shaking hands with mine safety inspectors. The date stamp read March 15, 2020, 2 weeks before the cave-in that killed Ellen and Sarah Murphy. Across the street, Sargent maintained his vigil, a scarred sentinel guarding secrets the town wanted to keep buried. The police whistle felt cold against Dot's palm as she turned it over in the morning light. She'd found it buried in Harold's desk drawer beneath unpaid bills and fishing licenses, tarnished silver that once commanded respect from both criminals and K-9 partners. Harold had carried it for 37 years, through drug busts in Charleston and domestic disputes in the hollers. "Let's see if you remember your training, boy," she whispered, stepping onto her porch. The sharp blast cut through October air like a blade. Sargent's head snapped up from his position by the storm drain, ears erect, body rigid with recognition. In one fluid motion, he rose and trotted toward her, his limp barely noticeable as muscle memory overrode injury. He sat at perfect attention 3 feet away, eyes locked on hers with an intelligence that made her breath catch. This wasn't a stray dog. This was a trained officer waiting for orders. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Dot breathed. You're police, aren't you? At the word police, Sergeant's tail wagged once. Not the exuberant wiggling of a pet, but the controlled acknowledgement of a working dog hearing familiar terminology. Harold had described it once. They know they're different from house dogs, Dot. They know they have a job. The financial pressure had been building like water behind a cracked dam. The tax notice on her kitchen table now bore a red stamp. Final notice. 15 days remaining. $2,847 might as well have been $28,000 on her Social Security income. She'd already canceled the cable, switched to generic medications, and rationed her heart pills to every other day. A dangerous gamble that left her dizzy and short of breath. But watching Sargent's professional composure, something Harold used to say echoed in her memory. Sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing. That's when you find out what you're made of. Doctor. Marcus Jenkins ran the only veterinary clinic within 50 miles, a converted gas station that smelled of antiseptic and dog biscuits. At 64, he'd seen enough abused animals to recognize the signs. Cigarette burns disguised as accidents, broken bones from falls, the hollow-eyed stare of creatures who'd learned that humans meant pain. But when Dot led Sargent through the clinic door, Jenkins saw something different. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, watching Sargent's measured gait, his alert posture, the way he scanned the room for threats before settling. "This is a working dog. Police or military, I'd bet my license on it." The examination revealed what Dot had suspected. Sargent's scars weren't from dogfights or abuse. The puncture wounds on his chest matched entry points for shotgun pellets. The gash across his shoulder showed surgical precision. Someone had dug out shrapnel. His right hind leg bore the telltale signs of a fracture that had healed without proper setting. "He's been in combat," Jenkins said, running his hands along Sargent's flanks. "These injuries, they're from someone trying to kill him." "How long ago?" 3 years, maybe 4. The bone calluses are well formed, but the muscle compensation patterns are still developing." Jenkins met her eyes over Sargent's head. "Mrs. Henderson, this dog survived something that should have killed him, and judging by his behavior, he's still fighting that war." The payment plan Jenkins offered was generous, $20 monthly until the $200 examination was covered. But even $20 meant choosing between medication and groceries, between heat and hope. That evening, Dot sat at her kitchen table with Harold's wedding ring between her fingers. The simple gold band had cost him 2 weeks' salary in 1965, purchased with overtime shifts and dreams of their future together. Pawn shops in Charleston would give her maybe $300 for it, enough to keep the lights on another month. The sound of voices outside drew her to the window. Mrs. Patterson stood on her porch, gesturing animatedly to a small crowd of neighbors. Eleanor Kaufman, 85 and built like a sparrow, clutched a casserole dish. Tom Bradley, the retired coal miner from 2 houses down, leaned heavily on his walker. Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose late husband had worked dispatch with Harold, held a manila folder thick with papers. "Dangerous animal roaming our streets," Patterson was saying. "My grandson visits every Sunday. What if that beast attacks him? What if it attacks any of us?" Tom Bradley's voice carried the wheeze of black lung disease. "I can barely walk as it is. Can't outrun no mad dog." But Eleanor Kaufman stepped forward, her voice sharp as her mother's china. "Mary Patterson, that dog's been here 3 years without hurting a soul." "You're just looking for something to complain about since your stories ran out." "Stories?" Patterson's face flushed crimson. "I'll have you know—" "I know you called the mayor's office 4 times this week," Mary Catherine interrupted, waving her folder. "I still have friends at City Hall, and I know Clayton Murphy's been looking for excuses to seal up those old drains since he took office. Dot grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The conversation died as 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her, some sympathetic, others wary, all curious about the old nurse who'd become the center of their latest controversy. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used to quiet panicked families in hospital waiting rooms. "I couldn't help but overhear the discussion about Sargent." "Sargent?" Tom Bradley squinted. "You named the thing?" "I named him what he is, a working dog with a job to do." Dot moved down her porch steps, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. "That animal has been feeding kittens trapped in the storm drain. He's not dangerous. He's heroic." "Heroic?" Patterson scoffed. "It's a mangy stray with delusions." "No, Mary." Eleanor Kaufman's voice carried surprising steel. "He's not mangy, and he's not stray. Look at him." All eyes turned toward the storm drain, where Sargent maintained his vigil in the gathering dusk. Even from a distance his military bearing was unmistakable, the straight spine, the alert ears, the controlled stillness of someone trained to watch and wait. "My late husband trained police dogs in Korea," Mary Catherine said quietly. "I know the stance. That's not a pet that got loose. That's an officer on duty." "Officer?" Tom Bradley's wheezing laugh turned into a cough. "Dogs ain't officers. Tell that to Harold Henderson," Eleanor snapped. "His K-9 partner saved 2 children from that house fire on Elm Street back in '98. Nearly died doing it, too." The mention of Harold sent a familiar ache through Dot's chest. She could see him in her memory, coming home from that call with singed eyebrows and soot-stained uniform, talking about how his partner had refused to leave the burning building until every child was safe. "If Sargent's protecting those kittens," she said, "then someone needs to get them out safely, not seal them up to die." "And who's going to pay for that?" Patterson demanded. "The town's broke, case you hadn't noticed. We can't afford fancy rescue operations for every stray cat." "I'll pay," Dot said, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. The crowd fell silent. Everyone knew Dorothy Henderson's financial situation. Widow's gossip traveled faster than wildfire in a town of 847 people. "Dot," Eleanor said gently. "Honey, you don't have that kind of money." "Then I'll find it." Dot's chin lifted with the stubborn pride that had carried her through 37 years of 12-hour shifts and life-or-death decisions. "Some things matter more than money." "Like what?" Patterson's voice dripped skepticism. Dot looked toward Sargent, still maintaining his faithful watch, and thought of Harold's voice. "Sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing." "Like keeping promises," she said. "Like not abandoning those who can't speak for themselves. Like remembering that we're supposed to be neighbors, not strangers who happen to live on the same street." The silence stretched until Mary Catherine cleared her throat. "Well, I think Mrs. Henderson's right. That dog's been more neighborly than some people I could mention." Tom Bradley shifted on his walker, studying Sargent with new eyes. "Harold Henderson was good people. If his widow thinks that dog's worth saving, maybe we ought to listen." Even Patterson seemed to deflate slightly, her righteous anger replaced by something that might have been doubt. As the neighbors dispersed, Dot remained on her porch, watching Sargent's silhouette against the darkening sky. The financial reality hadn't changed. She still couldn't afford a rescue operation, still faced losing her house, still had to choose between medication and survival. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt something she'd forgotten: purpose. Fire Chief Billy Rawlings arrived at Dot's house in his personal truck, a dented Ford pickup that had seen better decades. At 55, Billy carried himself with the careful posture of someone who'd pulled too many bodies from too many disasters. His friendship with Harold went back 30 years, to shared shifts and shared bourbon after the bad calls. "Dorothy," "You know I can't make this official," he said, accepting the coffee she offered on her front porch. "Murphy's made it clear. Any city resources used on that drain situation will come out of my budget, and my budget's already stretched thinner than communion wine. I'm not asking for official help, Billy." Dot settled into Harold's old rocking chair, the wood worn smooth by decades of evening conversations. "I'm asking for a friend to take a look with some equipment you might happen to have in your truck." Billy's weathered face cracked a small smile. "Harold always said you could convince the devil to buy ice water." He sipped his coffee, studying Sergeant's motionless form by the storm drain. "That dog really been there every day for 3 years? Rain or shine, snow or heat, never misses his schedule. Animals don't keep schedules like that unless they're trained." Billy set down his mug with a thoughtful click, "or unless they're guarding something that matters more than their own comfort." The rescue camera was a snake-like device the fire department used for collapsed building searches. 30 feet of fiber optic cable with a waterproof light and camera head. Billy operated it from a tablet while Dot held her breath, watching the screen as the camera descended into the storm drain's darkness. "There," she breathed, pointing at movement on the screen. "Do you see them?" The camera revealed 5 cats huddled on a concrete ledge about 12 feet down, 4 kittens and what appeared to be their mother, though the adult cat wasn't moving. But as the camera swept the narrow space, it caught something else that made Billy curse under his breath. "Jesus Christ, Dorothy. That's not just cats down there." Tangled among the feline family were scraps of pink fabric, a child's jacket, water-stained but recognizable, a small backpack wedged against the concrete wall, and something that made Dot's nurse training kick into overdrive, the unmistakable curve of bone bleached white by years of underground moisture. "Billy," she whispered, "we need to call the police." "With what jurisdiction? Murphy's made it clear the drains are off limits, and the state police won't come without local authorization." Billy rewound the camera feed, his expression grim. "Dorothy, what we're looking at down there, that's not a rescue situation anymore. It's a recovery." That evening, Dot sat at her kitchen table with Harold's case files spread before her like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The Murphy development folder contained photographs, inspection reports, and Harold's handwritten notes in the careful script she'd watched him perfect over decades of police reports. March 15, 2020. Safety inspection of Hartwell Mine Shaft Number 3. Present, Mayor Clayton Murphy, State Inspector Douglas Webb, Mine Foreman Rick Santos. Harold's notes in the margin. Webb seemed nervous, avoided eye contact. Santos kept checking his phone. March 18, 2020. Second inspection, same location. Different state inspector, Karen Mitchell, who Harold noted as thorough, asked difficult questions about structural integrity. March 28, 2020. Mine collapse at Hartwell Shaft Number 3. 2 fatalities. Ellen Murphy, 41, and Sarah Murphy, 8. Cause officially listed as unforeseen geological instability. But Harold's personal notes told a different story. Spoke with Rick Santos privately. Says first inspection was falsified. Webb took payoff to overlook support beam deterioration. Mitchell's second inspection found critical problems, but report was buried before repairs could be made. The final entry dated April 2, 2020, just days before Harold's heart attack. Murphy knows his wife and daughter died because of his corner cutting. Massive guilt driving erratic behavior, need to approach carefully, grieving father, but also potential criminal. Dot's hands trembled as she read Harold's last words about the case. Clayton's not evil, just broken. But broken people can be dangerous when cornered. If something happens to me, make sure someone follows up on the Santos testimony. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Dr. Marcus Jenkins arrived first, his veterinary bag in hand and determination in his eyes. "I've been thinking about that dog all night, Mrs. Henderson. Those injuries, that training, the way he guards that specific location. There's a story there, and I think it connects to more than just trapped cats." Behind him came Eleanor Kaufman, carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression of a woman who'd made up her mind about something important. "Dorothy Henderson, I've lived in this town 85 years, and I've never seen anything like what that dog's been doing. If he's protecting something, then by God, we're going to find out what. Eleanor, you don't understand the risks. Don't you dare Eleanor me like I'm some fragile flower." The elderly woman's voice carried surprising steel. "I buried my husband in Korea, raised 4 children through the mine closures, and survived the flood of '85. I think I can handle whatever's down a storm drain." Mary Catherine O'Brien arrived next, her manila folder thicker than before. "I've been making calls," she announced, settling her considerable bulk into Dot's kitchen chair. "My friend Susie still works dispatch for the county sheriff. Interesting thing about those drains, they've been sealed off one by one over the past 2 years. All by mayoral order, all with concrete, all without proper environmental assessment." "How many?" Dot asked. 17 so far. Storm drain 47 is scheduled to be sealed next week." Mary Catherine opened her folder, revealing maps and official documents. "But here's the curious part. Every drain that's been sealed connects to the old Hartwell mine system." Dr. Jenkins looked up from examining photos of Sergeant's scars. "The same mine where Murphy's family died?" "The very same." And according to Susie, Harold Henderson had requested access to those sealed drains just days before his heart attack. Official request for police investigation citing potential evidence in ongoing case. The pieces were clicking together in Dot's mind like tumblers in a lock. Harold had been investigating the mine disaster. He'd discovered evidence of corruption, corner cutting, maybe even criminal negligence. And then he'd died, leaving his investigation unfinished and his K-9 partner to guard whatever evidence remained. "We need to get down there," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Before Murphy seals that drain, before those kittens die, before whatever Harold discovered gets buried forever." "Dorothy," Eleanor said gently, "you're 72 years old with a heart condition. And you're 85 with arthritis, Marcus is dealing with a herniated disc, and Mary Catherine can barely fit through her own front door." Dot stood up, channeling every ounce of authority she'd ever possessed in an ICU. "But we're the only ones who give a damn about the truth." The rescue operation began at dawn on October 24th. Billy Rawlings had borrowed rope and safety equipment from the fire station, while Dr. Jenkins brought sedatives and carriers for the cats. Eleanor arrived with enough coffee and sandwiches to feed a small army, and Mary Catherine had positioned herself as communications coordinator, though with whom exactly remained unclear. Sergeant's reaction to the activity was immediate and protective. As Billy approached the storm drain with equipment, the German shepherd planted himself directly over the grate, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," Dot murmured, approaching slowly with Harold's police whistle in her hand. "We're here to help." The whistle's sharp blast made Sergeant's ears perk up, but he didn't move from his defensive position. Whatever was down there, he'd been guarding it for 3 years. And trust didn't come easily. "He thinks we're a threat," Dr. Jenkins observed. "In his mind, he's the only thing standing between whatever's down there and people who might harm it." Dot knelt beside Sergeant, her arthritic knees protesting against the cold concrete. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his amber eyes, the careful assessment of each person and their intentions. This wasn't just a dog, this was Harold's partner, trained to evaluate threats and protect evidence. "I know you miss him," she whispered, her hand hovering near Sargent's scarred head. "I miss him too, but Harold would want us to finish what he started." At the mention of Harold's name, something shifted in Sargent's posture. His growl faded, replaced by the soft whine of a creature caught between duty and need. Slowly, carefully, he stepped aside from the grate. Billy's descent into the storm drain revealed the full scope of what Sargent had been guarding. The 5 cats were in poor condition. The mother had died recently, probably from illness, while the 4 kittens survived on whatever food Sargent had been dropping down. But the human remains were what made Billy's voice shake as he radioed up through the walkie-talkie. "Dorothy, you need to hear this. These bones, they're small, child-sized, and they're not old. Maybe 3 years based on the fabric preservation." "Sarah Murphy," Dot breathed. "There's more." "Looks like someone wrapped the remains in a blanket. Police issue by the material. And there's a badge down here, K9 unit badge with an inscription." "What does it say?" Billy's voice cracked slightly as he read, "Officer Harold Henderson and Partner Sargent, Faithful Service, 1985-2020. The truth hit Dot like a physical blow. Harold hadn't died of a heart attack while investigating the mine disaster. He'd died trying to rescue Sarah Murphy. And Sargent had been with him, had survived whatever killed his handler, had wrapped the child's body in Harold's blanket and stood guard for 3 years. "Get him out of there," she called down to Billy, her voice breaking. "Get them all out." The rescue took 4 hours. Billy emerged first with the 4 surviving kittens, mewing weakly but alive. Dr. Jenkins immediately began IV fluids and warming protocols, his veterinary training shifting into emergency mode. Then came the harder recovery. Sarah Murphy's remains, carefully wrapped in Harold's police blanket, along with his badge and the case notes he'd died protecting. Mayor Clayton Murphy arrived as Billy was sealing the evidence bags. His black Suburban screeched to a halt, and he emerged looking like a man who'd seen his worst nightmare materialize. "What the hell do you people think you're doing?" His voice carried authority, but Dot could hear the fear underneath. "The right thing," she replied, standing despite her trembling legs. "Something Harold died trying to do." Murphy's face went white as he saw the small bundle in Billy's arms, his daughter's remains, finally brought into the light after 3 years in darkness. "You don't understand," he whispered, all his mayoral bluster evaporating. "I never meant... She wasn't supposed to be there. Ellen took her to see the mine before we closed it down for good. I told them to stay out of the dangerous areas, but Sarah was always so curious. And Harold tried to save her," Dot finished. "Just like Sargent's been trying to save her ever since." Murphy collapsed onto the curb, his face in his hands. "I sealed the other drains because I couldn't bear the thought. I knew she was down there somewhere, but I couldn't face. And then when that dog showed up and wouldn't leave..." "You knew," Eleanor Kaufman's voice cut like a blade, "you knew that dog was guarding your daughter, and you were going to seal him in with her." "I thought it would be kinder." Murphy's anguish exploded out of him. "Better than letting him suffer, better than facing what I'd done to my own family through my greed and shortcuts and..." Sargent approached the broken man slowly, his limp more pronounced after the morning's stress. Instead of aggression, he showed something that looked almost like compassion, the recognition of shared grief, shared guilt, shared loss. As the authorities were called and the investigation officially began, Dot sat on her porch with the 4 rescued kittens warming in a box beside her chair. Sargent lay at her feet, no longer guarding a storm drain, but finally able to rest. His vigil was over, his duty complete. The evening news would call it a rescue operation, but Dot knew better. It was a homecoming. For Sarah Murphy, for Harold's memory, for a faithful dog who'd never stopped believing that someone would eventually understand what he was trying to protect. And for a lonely widow who'd discovered that family wasn't always about blood relations, but sometimes about shared purpose and the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything you have. The October sky turned the peculiar gray-green that old-timers recognized as storm weather, and the barometric pressure drop made Dot's arthritis flare like fire in her joints. Hurricane Delilah's remnants were tracking inland from the Carolinas, bringing with it the kind of rain that turned mountain creeks into torrents and storm drains into death traps. "We need those kittens out today," Dr. Jenkins said, checking his weather radio in Dot's kitchen. "Flash flood warning goes into effect at 6 p.m. if that drain system backs up." He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood that rising water would drown anything still trapped below ground. The 4 kittens they'd seen on the camera would die, along with any evidence Harold had died protecting. Sargent paced the length of Dot's front porch, his military training warring with growing anxiety. Every few minutes he'd trot to the porch rail and stare toward the storm drain, then return to Dot's side with a soft whine. He could sense the approaching danger in ways humans couldn't. The change in air pressure, the shift in wind patterns, the electrical charge building in the atmosphere. At 11 a.m., the first official responder arrived. Detective Ray Morrison from the County Sheriff's Department, a lean man in his 50s who'd worked with Harold on several cases. He parked his unmarked sedan beside the growing collection of vehicles: Billy's fire truck, Dr. Jenkins' clinic van, Eleanor's ancient Buick, and Mary Catherine's granddaughter's Honda. "Mrs. Henderson," Morrison said, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I hear you've uncovered something significant." "More than significant," Dot replied, leading him to where Billy had set up the rescue equipment. "Detective, I believe my husband was murdered." The word hung in the air like smoke. Morrison's expression sharpened, his casual demeanor shifting into professional focus. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "Harold's death certificate lists cardiac arrest." "Cardiac arrest brought on by what?" Dot pulled out Harold's case files, her fingers steady despite the gravity of what she was suggesting. "Look at these dates, Detective. Harold requested access to sealed mine areas on April 1, 2020. He died of a heart attack on April 3rd, 2 days after he discovered evidence of criminal negligence in the Murphy mine disaster." Morrison studied the documents, his frown deepening. "You're saying Mayor Murphy had Harold killed?" "I'm saying Harold died trying to rescue Sarah Murphy from a mine shaft that collapsed because of falsified safety reports. And I think someone wanted to make sure he never testified about what he found down there." The detective's radio crackled with weather updates. "All units, Hurricane Watch upgraded to Hurricane Warning. Expect sustained winds of 65 mph with gusts to 85. Flash flooding likely in low-lying areas." "We're running out of time," Billy Rawlings called from beside the storm drain. "Water level's already rising. I can hear it moving through the tunnels." At 1 p.m., Mayor Murphy's black Suburban arrived with 2 vehicles behind it, a county animal control van and a municipal works truck loaded with concrete mixing equipment. Murphy emerged looking haggard, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. "This operation stops now," he announced, his mayoral authority cracking around the edges. "I have a court order sealing this drain for public safety. Hurricane's coming, and I won't have anyone else die because of those damned tunnels." Detective Morrison stepped forward, his badge visible on his belt. "Mayor Murphy, this is now an active crime scene." "That court order doesn't supersede a homicide investigation." "Homicide?" Murphy's face went ashen. "Who said anything about homicide? Mrs. Henderson has presented compelling evidence that Officer Harold Henderson's death wasn't natural. Evidence suggesting he was killed to prevent testimony about criminal negligence in your family's mining accident." Murphy staggered as if struck. You think I killed Harold Henderson?" "I think someone did," Morrison replied evenly. "And I think they did it to cover up the truth about what happened at Hartwell Mine." The wind picked up, sending autumn leaves spiraling around the growing crowd. Sargent's agitation increased, his pacing becoming more frantic. He could sense something the humans couldn't, not just the approaching storm, but movement in the underground tunnels, the sound of water finding new channels through decades-old mine shafts. At 2:30 p.m., the real drama began. Eleanor Kaufman, despite her 85 years and arthritis, had been monitoring emergency radio channels on her late husband's ham radio setup. "Dorothy," she called from her porch, waving frantically. "The creek's jumped its banks upstream. Water's backing up in the whole drain system." As if summoned by her words, the first trickle of muddy water began seeping from the storm drain grate. Within minutes it became a steady flow, then a rushing stream that sent Sargent into full alert mode. "Everyone back!" Billy shouted, but Sargent had other ideas. The German shepherd suddenly bolted toward the drain, not away from it. He began pawing frantically at the grate, his claws scraping against metal as he tried to dig through solid steel. "He knows they're still down there," Dot breathed, understanding flooding through her. "The kittens. We saw 5 cats on the camera, but Billy only brought up 4. Dr. Jenkins went pale. "The mother cat." "I assumed she was dead, but what if she was just unconscious? What if she's revived and is trying to save her remaining kitten?" The water level rose visibly as they watched, transforming from a trickle to a torrent. In 15 minutes the entire drain system would be flooded. Anything still alive down there would drown. "I'm going down," Billy announced, reaching for his rope harness. "The hell you are?" Detective Morrison grabbed his arm. "That's a death trap. The current's too strong. The tunnels are unstable. There's still a life down there." "Maybe. But we know for certain there are lives up here that'll be lost if you go down that hole." Sargent's desperate pawing became more frantic. He looked between the adults, his amber eyes pleading, then did something that broke Dot's heart. He began to howl. Not the aggressive growl of a guard dog, but the mournful cry of a creature watching everything he'd protected slip away. "Wait," Dot said, an idea forming. "Sargent's small enough to fit through spaces we can't, and he's trained for search and rescue." "Dorothy, no," Eleanor protested. "You can't send that dog down there to die." "I'm not sending him to die. I'm giving him a chance to finish what Harold started." Dot knelt beside Sargent, her arthritic knees screaming protest. "Boy, if there's still someone down there, you find them. You bring them home." She clipped a small waterproof camera to Sargent's collar, the same one Billy had used for reconnaissance. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She kissed the top of his scarred head. "Go get them, officer." Sargent didn't hesitate. He squeezed through the drain grate with the determination of a dog bred for impossible missions. The camera feed on Billy's tablet showed his descent into rising water, his powerful swimming stroke carrying him deeper into the flooded tunnels. For 8 agonizing minutes they watched Sargent navigate a maze of concrete passages and mine shaft connections, the water level rising steadily around him. Twice, the camera showed him surface in air pockets, gasping for breath before plunging back into the dark water. "There!" Mary Catherine pointed at the screen. "Movement in that alcove!" The camera revealed what they'd feared. A 5th kitten, barely alive, clinging to a concrete ledge as water lapped at its tiny paws. But it wasn't alone. The mother cat, very much alive, was trying desperately to move her baby to higher ground. Sargent reached them just as the water covered their ledge. In a display of intelligence that left the watchers speechless, he gently took the kitten in his mouth while somehow communicating to the mother cat that he was there to help, not harm. The return journey was a race against time and rising water. Sargent had to surface 4 times for air, each time in smaller pockets as the flood filled every available space. The camera showed his powerful legs working against the current, the mother cat swimming beside him, both focused solely on saving the tiny life between Sargent's gentle jaws. When Sargent finally emerged from the drain, he was exhausted, hypothermic, and barely conscious. But clutched carefully in his mouth was the fifth kitten, alive and mewing. The mother cat followed seconds later, collapsing on the sidewalk beside her rescuer. Dr. Jenkins immediately began emergency treatment for all three: warming protocols, IV fluids, oxygen support. "They're going to make it," he announced after several tense minutes. "All of them." As the veterinarian worked, Detective Morrison made an arrest that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. Mayor Clayton Murphy, charged with criminal negligence in the deaths of Harold Henderson, Ellen Murphy, and Sarah Murphy. But the biggest revelation came from Murphy himself as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I didn't kill Harold," he said, his voice broken, "but I might as well have. I knew the mine was unstable. I knew the safety reports were falsified. And when Harold found the evidence, when he came to me with proof that my corner cutting killed my own family, I couldn't face it. I had a heart attack right there in his office. Harold tried to save me, gave me CPR, called the ambulance. The stress of trying to save the man whose greed had killed his daughter, that's what gave him the coronary. He died trying to save the life of the man who'd destroyed his investigation." The storm hit Millbrook Falls at 4 p.m., but by then, everyone was safe. Sargent recovered in Dot's living room, wrapped in Harold's old police blanket. The 5 cats, 4 kittens, and their mother slept in a warm box by the fireplace. And for the first time in 3 years, Dorothy Henderson felt like she had a family again. Outside, Hurricane Delilah raged against the mountains, but inside there was warmth, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of promises kept. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on October 28th, jarring Dot from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. Sargent, who'd been recovering on Harold's old recliner, immediately went rigid with alert tension as the phone's shrill ring cut through the darkness. "Mrs. Henderson?" The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Reeves from Charleston General Hospital. "I'm calling about Mayor Murphy. He's asked to see you. It's urgent." Clayton Murphy lay in the cardiac care unit, looking older than his 58 years. The heart attack had struck during his interrogation with Detective Morrison. Stress-induced, the doctor said, brought on by years of carrying guilt that had finally found its voice. Handcuffs chained him to the hospital bed, but the man inside them looked more like a broken father than a dangerous criminal. "Dorothy," he whispered when she entered the room, his voice raw from the breathing tube they'd removed an hour earlier. "Thank you for coming." "I came for Harold," she replied, taking the visitor's chair with careful dignity. "And for your daughter, not for you." Murphy's eyes filled with tears that had been 3 years in the making. "Sarah loved animals. Did you know that? She was always bringing home strays, birds with broken wings, cats with one eye, dogs that other people threw away. Ellen used to joke that our backyard was Sarah's personal animal rescue center." Despite herself, Dot felt a flicker of the compassion that had sustained her through 37 years of nursing. "She sounds like a special little girl." She was. And I killed her. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Not directly, but those falsified safety reports, the bribes to inspectors, the corners I cut to increase profits, every single decision led to that mine collapse. My greed killed my wife and daughter. What about Harold? Murphy closed his eyes, the heart monitors beeping the only sound for long moments. Harold came to my office on April 3rd with evidence. Photos of the structural damage we'd ignored, testimony from workers who'd reported safety violations, copies of the real inspection reports that showed the mine should have been closed months earlier. He had everything. And I broke down completely. Started sobbing like a child, admitting everything, begging him to understand that I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The stress hit me like a freight train. Chest pains, couldn't breathe. Thought I was dying. Murphy's voice became barely audible. Harold didn't arrest me. He called 911, started CPR, stayed with me until the ambulance arrived. While I was having my heart attack, he was saving my life. Dot felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened next? The paramedics got me stabilized and Harold rode with me to the hospital. But the stress of trying to save the man who'd killed his community. It triggered his own cardiac event in the ambulance. He died holding my hand, telling me I still had time to do the right thing. The monitors beeped steadily as Murphy's confession continued. After Harold died, I could have come clean, should have, but I was terrified of prison, of losing everything, of the whole town knowing I'd murdered my own family through negligence. So I buried Harold's investigation along with his body. And Sergeant? Harold's K-9 partner disappeared the night of the mine collapse. I assumed he'd died in the shaft along with Sarah. When he showed up 3 years later, sitting by that storm drain, Murphy's voice broke completely. I knew, somehow, I knew what he was guarding down there. But I couldn't face it. Dot stood to leave, but Murphy's desperate voice stopped her. The other drains I sealed. There are more bodies down there. 3 children who went missing in the late 80s and early 90s. The old mine system was like a maze, and kids would explore the entrances, get lost, fall into water-filled shafts. Their families never knew what happened to them. The weight of this revelation settled on Dot's shoulders like a lead blanket. How many families have been wondering, Clayton? How many parents died never knowing where their children were? 7 that I know of, maybe more. Murphy's breathing became labored as emotion overwhelmed his damaged heart. I sealed those drains to hide the evidence, but I told myself I was protecting people from dangerous areas. Even my lies had lies. By dawn, Dot had called Detective Morrison with Murphy's confessions. The investigation that followed would uncover the largest cover-up in West Virginia mining history, 17 deaths over 3 decades, all connected to Murphy Development's systematic safety violations and bribery of state inspectors. But the personal cost was only beginning to reveal itself. Back home, Sergeant's condition had worsened during Dot's hospital visit. Dr. Jenkins arrived to find the German Shepherd barely responsive, his breathing shallow and labored. It's not physical, Jenkins explained after a thorough examination. His heart is strong, his injuries are healing, but it's like he's lost the will to fight. In veterinary medicine, we call it broken heart syndrome. He's completed his mission, and now his body is shutting down. Eleanor Kaufman, who'd been helping care for the 5 cats, looked stricken. You mean he's dying because he's fulfilled his purpose? Working dogs live for their jobs. When that job ends, especially traumatically, they sometimes just fade away. I've seen it in retired police dogs, military dogs, search and rescue animals. They define themselves by their work, and without it. Dot knelt beside Sergeant's bed, her own heart breaking as she watched his labored breathing. What can we do? Give him a new purpose, something worth living for. The answer came from an unexpected source, the mother cat, whom they'd named Grace. Despite her own exhaustion and trauma, Grace had claimed Sergeant as her protector. She curled up against his side, purring with a rumbling intensity that seemed to comfort the grieving dog. Her 4 kittens followed her lead, creating a furry pile of warmth and life around Sergeant's still form. Look at that, Dr. Jenkins said softly. She's adopted him. Over the next 3 days, something remarkable happened. As Sergeant's physical strength slowly returned, his emotional healing began through his relationship with the cat family he'd saved. Grace would bring him food, refusing to eat until he did. The kittens played around his legs, their antics coaxing the first tail wags anyone had seen from him since the rescue. But the real turning point came when the smallest kitten, a gray tabby they'd named Hope, got tangled in the yarn Eleanor had brought for the cats to play with. The kitten's distressed mewing triggered something in Sargent's training. Despite his weakness, he carefully freed the tiny creature, then carried her to safety with the same gentle precision he'd shown during the storm drain rescue. He's got a new mission, Dot realized, watching Sargent position himself protectively around the cat family. He's not just guarding evidence anymore, he's protecting his family. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Sargent began eating regularly, taking short walks around the house, even playing gentle games with the kittens. His police training adapted to domestic life. He'd patrol the house at night, check on each cat, then return to his bed, satisfied that his charges were safe. But the deepest healing came from an unexpected source: forgiveness. On Halloween morning, Detective Morrison arrived with news that Clayton Murphy had died peacefully in his sleep, his damaged heart finally giving out under the weight of 3 years' worth of suppressed guilt. His last official act had been signing over his entire estate to establish a fund for the families of his victims, a gesture that couldn't restore the dead but could help the living begin to heal. "He left something for you," Morrison said, handing Dot a sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph of Sarah Murphy with her beloved animals, 3 cats, 2 dogs, and a rabbit, all rescue animals she'd saved. On the back, Murphy had written, "Sarah would have loved Sargent. Thank you for giving her the hero she deserved." That evening, as Dot sat on her porch watching Sargent supervise the kitten's exploration of the yard, she felt a peace she hadn't known since Harold's death. The financial pressures remained: the veterinary bills, the house payments, the daily struggle of fixed-income living. But for the first time in 3 years, she had a family again. Grace jumped onto her lap, purring contentedly, while Sargent settled at her feet with the 4 kittens arranged around him like a furry honor guard. The storm had passed, the truth had been revealed, and the long vigil was finally over. But the real tragedy was yet to come. The truth arrived in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror that only revealed its full horror when assembled. Detective Morrison returned on November 2nd with Harold's recovered police body camera, its memory card somehow intact after 3 years submerged in mine water. The footage would change everything they thought they knew about that terrible night in 2020. "Dorothy, you need to prepare yourself," Morrison warned, setting up the laptop in her living room. Sargent lay nearby, surrounded by his adopted cat family, but his ears pricked forward as if sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. "This recording, it's going to be difficult to watch." The timestamp read April 2nd, 2020, 11:47 p.m. Harold's flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness as he descended into Hartwell mine shaft number 3, following the sounds of a child's terrified screams. Sargent's heavy breathing was audible beside him, the dog's training evident in his controlled movements through treacherous terrain. Sarah Murphy, can you hear me?" Harold's voice echoed in the confined space. "This is Officer Henderson. I'm here to help you." The response was weak but audible. "Help! Please, I can't move. Mama won't wake up." What the camera revealed next would haunt Dot for the rest of her days. Ellen Murphy lay motionless beneath a fallen beam, clearly dead from the impact. 8-year-old Sarah was trapped beside her mother's body, her left leg pinned under debris, conscious but fading from shock and blood loss. "I'm coming, sweetheart." Harold's voice remained steady, professional, even as his breathing became labored from the unstable air in the collapsed mine. "Sargent's with me. He's going to help us get you out." The camera showed Harold's approach to the trapped child, his movements careful but urgent. He began working to free Sarah's leg while Sargent stood guard, the dog's training evident in how he positioned himself to watch for further cave-ins. "My daddy," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "My daddy said the mine was safe. He promised." "Your daddy loves you very much," Harold replied, his voice strained as he lifted debris. "We're going to get you back to him." But as Harold worked, the camera captured something that made Dot's blood run cold. In the background, barely visible in the flashlight's periphery, was another figure. Someone else was in the mine, moving deliberately through the shadows. "Harold," Dot whispered to the screen, "behind you." The footage showed Harold finally freeing Sarah's leg, the child crying out in pain, but relief as circulation returned. He was preparing to carry her out when Sargent suddenly went rigid, his hackles rising as he faced something outside the camera's range. "What is it, boy?" Harold asked, following his partner's gaze. The answer came in the form of a voice from the darkness. Clayton Murphy's voice, but not the broken man Dot had visited in the hospital. This was someone desperate, calculating, dangerous. "Officer Henderson, I was hoping you wouldn't come down here." Harold's camera swung toward the sound, revealing Murphy emerging from the shadows, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Douglas Webb, the state mine inspector who'd falsified the safety reports, and Rick Santos, the mine foreman who'd been paid to stay quiet about structural problems. "Mayor Murphy." Harold's voice remained calm, but Dot could hear the tension underneath. "We need to get this child medical attention immediately." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Murphy replied, and the camera caught the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. "You see, Officer Henderson, Sarah wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Ellen brought her without my knowledge. They've seen things, heard conversations they shouldn't have." The full horror of what had really happened began to unfold. This hadn't been an accidental cave-in during a family visit. Ellen Murphy had discovered her husband's corruption and brought Sarah as a witness to confront the conspirators. The mine collapse had been deliberate, a murder disguised as an industrial accident. "You killed your own wife." Harold's voice carried disbelief and horror. "Your own daughter." "I killed no one." Murphy's voice cracked with desperate rationalization. "The mine was going to collapse anyway. We just accelerated the timeline. Ellen was going to expose everything, destroy me, destroy this whole town's economy. She wouldn't listen to reason." Sarah's weak voice interrupted. "Daddy." "Daddy, why are you holding a gun?" The camera shook as Harold's breathing became irregular, not from exertion, but from the stress of realizing he and Sarah were both witnesses to multiple homicides, trapped underground with 3 desperate men who had already killed to protect their secret. "Let me take the child out," Harold negotiated, his training evident in how he maintained calm in an impossible situation. "She's hurt badly. She needs a hospital." "The child dies here," Webb said coldly, "along with anyone else who knows what really happened." That's when Sargent acted. The camera caught a blur of motion as 90 pounds of trained German Shepherd launched himself at Webb, taking the man down with professional precision. The mine inspector's gun went flying into the darkness as Sargent's jaws found his throat. In the chaos that followed, Harold made his choice. Instead of fighting, instead of trying to escape, he threw himself over Sarah's small body as Murphy and Santos opened fire. The camera showed muzzle flashes, heard the echoing gunshots, captured Harold's grunt of pain as bullets found their mark. "Sergeant!" Harold's voice was weakening but still commanding. "Protect the girl! That's an order!" The camera showed Sargent reluctantly releasing his grip on Webb's throat and returning to Harold's side. Harold was bleeding heavily from wounds to his chest and abdomen, but his focus remained on Sarah. "Listen to me, sweetheart," he whispered to the terrified child. "I need you to be very brave. Sergeant's going to stay with you, okay? He's the best partner I ever had. He'll keep you safe." Murphy's voice came from the darkness. "Finish them both." But the mine had other plans. The gunfire had destabilized already weakened support beams, and a low rumbling filled the air, the sound of thousands of tons of rock beginning to shift. "The whole section's coming down!" Santos screamed. Harold used his last moments of consciousness to pull his police blanket from his pack and wrap it around Sarah. "Sergeant," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "Guard duty. Protect her. Don't let them take her." The camera showed Sergeant's amber eyes, intelligent and understanding, as he accepted his final orders from his dying partner. Then Harold's hand went limp and the camera angle shifted as it fell to the ground. What followed was chaos, the three men fleeing as the mine collapsed, Sarah's weak cries for help, and Sergeant's determined attempts to dig them out. The audio picked up the dog's whimpers of effort, his claws scraping against rock, his refusal to abandon his post, even as the situation became hopeless. The recording ended abruptly as debris finally buried the camera, but not before capturing one final heartbreaking sound. Sergeant's mournful howl as he realized his partner was dead and the child he'd been ordered to protect was dying in his arms. Detective Morrison stopped the playback, the silence in Dot's living room deafening. Through her tears, she could see Sergeant had risen from his bed and was staring at the laptop screen, his amber eyes reflecting a grief that had never fully healed. "The three men made it out," Morrison said quietly. "Webb died in a hunting accident 6 months later, probably Murphy silencing a witness. Santos disappeared, presumed dead. Murphy spent 3 years living with the knowledge that he'd murdered his own family and a police officer. And Sergeant," Dot's voice was barely a whisper, "somehow survived the final collapse. Probably found an air pocket, maybe an old mining tunnel that connected to the storm drain system. He stayed with Sarah's body for 3 days before making his way to the surface. By then, the accident had been investigated and closed. No one was looking for survivors because no one knew anyone else had been down there." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Sergeant had been following his last orders for 3 years, protecting Sarah Murphy, keeping vigil over her remains, refusing to abandon his post until someone finally understood what he was guarding. He never stopped being a police dog, Dot realized. He was protecting evidence, protecting Sarah, protecting Harold's memory. Morrison nodded grimly. "This recording changes everything. We can reopen the investigation, bring charges against anyone still alive who participated in the cover-up." Harold Henderson died a hero trying to save an innocent child from her own father's corruption. As if understanding that his vigil was finally complete, Sergeant approached Dot and gently placed his scarred head in her lap. For the first time since she'd known him, his amber eyes held peace instead of pain. The truth was finally out. Harold's sacrifice had meaning. Sarah Murphy could be properly buried, and a faithful dog could finally rest, knowing he'd completed his mission and kept his promise to his fallen partner. But even as one mystery was solved, Dot realized their story was far from over. They were a family now, broken pieces that had found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something new from the wreckage of their past. Spring came to Millbrook Falls like a gentle promise kept, painting the mountains in dogwood blossoms and redbud purple. 6 months had passed since the truth about Harold's death emerged, and the town bore little resemblance to the broken place it had been the previous October. The Murphy development scandal had triggered a federal investigation that brought both justice and unexpected prosperity. Compensation funds, infrastructure grants, and new businesses drawn by the community's remarkable story of courage and redemption. Dot Henderson sat on her front porch in Harold's old rocking chair, watching Sergeant supervise what had become known throughout West Virginia as the Miracle Cats. Grace, now a sleek and healthy mother, lounged in a patch of morning sunshine while her 4 grown kittens, Hope, Faith, Courage, and Justice, explored the garden with the fearless curiosity that had made them regional celebrities. The financial transformation had been as remarkable as the emotional healing. The GoFundMe page Eleanor Kaufman had started raised over $127,000 from across the country, with donations pouring in from police departments, animal rescue organizations, and ordinary people moved by Sargent's story of loyalty. The Murphy estate settlement provided additional compensation to Harold's widow, while book and movie deals offered a comfortable future Dot had never dared imagine. "Mrs. Henderson?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, a documentary filmmaker from New York who'd been following their story for months. "Are you ready for the final interview?" Dot nodded, her arthritis barely troubling her now that stress no longer ruled her days. Dr. Jenkins had attributed her improved health to what he called purpose therapy, the healing power of feeling needed, valued, essential to others' well-being. "Tell me about the morning everything changed," Sarah prompted, her camera capturing Dot's weathered hands stroking Sargent's graying muzzle. "I thought I was just helping a stray dog," Dot began, her voice carrying the wisdom of 73 years and 6 months of profound transformation. "But really he was helping me, teaching me that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about showing up when someone needs you most." The stories she told had been featured on CNN, Good Morning America, and countless local news programs. Hollywood producers were negotiating rights to The Dog Who Wouldn't Give Up, while publishers competed for her memoir. But for Dot, the real victory was quieter, more personal. Sargent had been officially certified as a therapy dog, his natural instincts channeled into helping other trauma survivors heal. Twice a week he visited the VA hospital in Charleston, where his presence seemed to unlock something in veterans struggling with PTSD. His scars, his limp, his gentle understanding of pain without judgment, these became sources of comfort for soldiers who'd lost hope. "He speaks their language," explained Dr. Maria Santos, the VA psychologist who'd requested Sargent's services. "Combat veterans often feel like no one understands what they've been through, but one look at Sargent and they know he's been to war too. He survived, and maybe they can too." The 5 cats had found their own purposes. Grace remained with Dot and Sargent, her maternal instincts making her the perfect companion for elderly neighbors who needed gentle company. Hope had been adopted by Eleanor Kaufman, becoming the beloved pet of Millbrook Falls' unofficial grandmother. Faith went to Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose granddaughter's autism seemed soothed by the cat's calm presence. Courage and Justice lived with Billy Rawlings and Dr. Jenkins, respectively, their playful antics bringing joy to men who'd spent careers dealing with emergencies and tragedies. Each adoption had been carefully considered, ensuring the cats went to homes where they'd be cherished rather than simply kept. The Murphy investigation had ultimately revealed 17 deaths connected to the development company's corruption, spanning 3 decades of falsified safety reports and bribed inspectors. Federal authorities prosecuted 6 surviving conspirators, while the EPA implemented new oversight procedures for abandoned mine sites throughout Appalachian coal country. Most importantly, the 17 victims finally received proper burials. Sarah Murphy was laid to rest beside her mother in Millbrook Falls Cemetery, her grave marked with a headstone that read, "Beloved daughter, protected by heroes, never forgotten." At the funeral, Sargent had stood silent vigil beside the small casket, his duty finally complete. Detective Morrison had been promoted to lead the state's new cold case recovery unit, specializing in cases involving abandoned mine systems. The unit had already solved 12 missing person cases using techniques developed during the Murphy investigation, bringing closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. But the real miracle, Dot continued in her interview, wasn't solving the mystery or catching the criminals. It was discovering that love doesn't diminish when you share it. It multiplies. The proof surrounded her daily. Mrs. Patterson, once Sargent's harshest critic, now baked dog treats every Sunday and had become one of Dot's closest friends. The elderly woman's transformation from bitter complainer to caring neighbor had inspired others to examine their own hearts, leading to a community-wide renewal of the neighborly spirit that had once defined small-town America. Tom Bradley, the retired miner with black lung disease, had started a weekly coffee gathering in Dot's living room where local seniors shared stories, played cards, and looked out for each other's well-being. What began as concern for one lonely widow had evolved into a support network that reached every elderly resident in town. Eleanor Kaufman, despite her 86 years, had organized a volunteer program pairing active seniors with those needing assistance. The program had reduced emergency room visits by 30% and decreased isolation-related depression among Millbrook Falls' aging population. Harold used to say that God's love works through ordinary people doing extraordinary things, Dot reflected. I thought he meant other people, doctors, firefighters, ministers. I never imagined it could mean an old woman and a broken dog choosing to care about each other. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Dot's sudden fame brought unwanted attention from scammers and fortune seekers, requiring legal protection and careful management of her affairs. The constant media requests exhausted her, and some neighbors resented the national spotlight on their previously anonymous community. But the core relationship between Dot, Sargent, and their extended family remained unshakable. They'd been forged in crisis and tempered by shared purpose, creating bonds that transcended the superficial connections of convenience or proximity. The hardest part, Dot admitted, was learning to trust happiness again. After Harold died, I thought joy was something that happened to other people. Sargent taught me that healing isn't about forgetting pain, it's about finding meaning in it. Dr. Jenkins had documented Sargent's own healing journey, presenting his case study at veterinary conferences across the country. The German Shepherd's recovery from trauma had become a model for treating PTSD in working dogs, leading to improved care for military and police canine units nationwide. Sargent showed us that purpose is medicine, Jenkins explained. When he was guarding the storm drain, his trauma was manageable because he had a mission. When we rescued the cats, he found a new mission. The key was never trying to eliminate his protective instincts, but channeling them toward healing rather than mere survival. The house itself had become a symbol of renewal. Volunteers had repaired the roof, painted the exterior, and landscaped the yard with flowers chosen specifically to attract butterflies, Sarah Murphy's favorite creatures, according to her childhood friends. The garden bloomed from April through October, a living memorial to innocence lost and hope recovered. On quiet evenings, Dot would find Sargent sitting in the garden, watching butterflies dance among the flowers. His amber eyes held peace now instead of vigilance, contentment replacing the hyper-alert tension that had defined his first 3 years of grief. I think he knows she's at peace, Dot told visitors who asked about these moments. Dogs understand things we don't, about loyalty, about love lasting beyond death, about the difference between guarding something and letting it go. The final surprise had come in February, when DNA analysis of evidence from Harold's recovered gear proved what many had suspected. Sargent wasn't just any police dog. He was Harold's original K9 partner from 1995 to 2003, thought killed in a car accident that had actually been a carefully staged cover-up. Harold had hidden Sargent's survival to protect him from retaliation, officially retiring him while unofficially keeping him as a companion. They were partners for 8 years before Harold faked his death, Morrison explained. When Harold was assigned to investigate Murphy development, he knew the dangers. He arranged for Sargent to disappear, thinking he was protecting him. But when Harold went into that mine and never came out, Sargent found his way back to finish what they'd started together. This revelation explained Sargent's exceptional training, his deep bond with Harold, and his unwavering dedication to their final mission. He hadn't been guarding evidence. He'd been keeping faith with a partner who'd trusted him with the most important case of their career. As spring turned toward summer, Dot began working on her memoir with a ghostwriter from New York. The book, tentatively titled The Dog Who Kept Faith, would donate proceeds to animal rescue organizations and police K-9 units nationwide. "What's the most important lesson you've learned?" Sarah Chen asked in her final question. Dot considered this, watching Sargent demonstrate a gentle play bow to Hope, who'd grown into a confident young cat unafraid of the large dog who'd helped save her life. "That it's never too late to matter," she said finally. "I thought my useful years were behind me, that I was just waiting to die. But sometimes life gives you a second chance disguised as a crisis. Sometimes the family you need most is the one that finds you when you've stopped looking." She paused, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude rather than grief. "Harold always said that love is the only thing that multiplies when you divide it. I thought I understood what he meant when we were young. But it took a broken dog and some abandoned kittens to show me the real truth, that choosing to care for others, even when it costs you everything, is what makes life worth living." As the interview concluded and the film crew packed their equipment, Dot remained on her porch watching her chosen family enjoy the golden hour before sunset. Sargent dozed in Harold's old recliner, Grace curled against his side, while Hope practiced hunting invisible prey in the butterfly garden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve others, new chances to prove that ordinary people could indeed do extraordinary things when love provided the motivation. But tonight, there was simply peace. The deep satisfaction of promises kept, duties fulfilled, and second chances embraced with grateful hearts. The German shepherd who'd looked into the storm drain daily had found something more valuable than evidence or answers. He'd found home. And in saving him, Dorothy Henderson had saved herself, proving that sometimes the most profound rescues happen when broken hearts choose to heal together. In the distance, church bells chimed the evening hour, their bronze voices carrying across a town transformed by the simple decision of one woman to care about one dog's mysterious vigil. It was a sound Harold would have loved, the music of community, of hope, of love multiplied rather than divided. And in her heart, Dot knew he was listening. For those of us who've reached the season where obituaries hold more familiar names than birth announcements, Dorothy Henderson's story cuts deep. At 72, she thought her meaningful years were behind her. Just another invisible widow counting pills and pennies, talking to photographs instead of people. How many of us recognize that hollow ache? The feeling that we've become background characters in our own lives, that our best contributions are memories gathering dust on shelves. But when a scarred German shepherd chose her porch to rest his weary bones, everything changed. Sargent didn't see a lonely old woman. He saw someone who still had love to give, still had fight left in her arthritic hands. Together, they proved that purpose doesn't retire at 65, that family isn't always blood, and that sometimes our greatest adventures begin when we think the story's over. Dorothy discovered what so many of us forget, that being needed is the fountain of youth, that caring for others multiplies our own healing, and that it's never too late to matter. In choosing to see beyond her own pain, she found the very thing that makes growing older beautiful, the wisdom to love without condition, the courage to act despite fear. What storm drain in your life might be hiding something that needs your attention? Have you ever felt invisible in your golden years, and what pulled you back into feeling purposeful? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.